In the vast, windswept grasslands of Central Asia, a new power was about to ignite. At the dawn of the 13th century, the world was a collection of isolated kingdoms and sprawling empires. The great civilizations of China, Persia, and Europe felt secure within their own borders. They traded and fought with their neighbors, but they could not imagine a force that would soon connect them all. This force would not rise from a grand city or an ancient dynasty. It would emerge from the harsh, nomadic world of the Mongolian steppe, led by a man once considered an outcast. The world was about to change forever, and honestly, few saw it coming. The story of the Mongol Empire is not just one of conquest, but of radical transformation. The Mongols were a scattered collection of rival tribes. They were pastoral nomads, their lives dictated by the seasons and the needs of their herds. They were fierce warriors, skilled horsemen, and brilliant archers, but their strength was turned inward. They fought constantly against one another for resources, territory, and honor. For centuries, this internal conflict kept them from becoming a unified power. No one believed these disparate clans could ever come together to challenge the established empires of the world. They were seen as barbarians on the fringe of civilization, a minor threat at best. But within this chaotic world, a vision for something greater was beginning to form, a vision that would unite them under a single banner. This sudden rise to global dominance remains one of history's most astonishing events. In just a few decades, a people who had no cities, no written language of their own, and no experience in governing would create the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. It stretched from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, connecting east and west in ways that were previously unimaginable. They did not just conquer, they absorbed, adapted, and reorganized the world around them. The Mongols were a catalyst for change, shattering old orders and laying the groundwork for a new era of global interaction and exchange. The impact of this explosion from the steppe was felt across continents. The Mongol armies brought destruction and fear on an unprecedented scale, but they also brought with them a new kind of order. They were not just destroyers, they were builders, administrators, and merchants. They created a system that protected trade routes, encouraged cultural exchange, and fostered a flow of ideas, technologies, and goods across their vast domain. To understand the modern world, with its interconnected economies and cultures, we must look back to the moment when a spark on the steppe set the world ablaze and brought distant civilizations into direct, sustained contact for the first time.
1, 2, 3.
The man who would become the great Genghis Khan was not born into power. He was born around 1162 and named Temujin, a name that gave little hint of his future destiny. His early life was one of extreme hardship and constant struggle. When he was just a boy, his father, a minor tribal chief, was poisoned by a rival clan. This act of treachery plunged his family into a desperate situation. Abandoned by their own tribe, Temujin, his mother, and his siblings were left to fend for themselves on the unforgiving steppe. They were outcasts, forced to survive by hunting small animals and foraging for roots, living in constant fear of starvation and attack. This brutal upbringing would become the crucible that forged his character. During these difficult years, Temujin learned lessons that would define his leadership. He learned the harsh reality of betrayal and the importance of loyalty. He understood that survival depended not on noble birth, but on strength, resilience, and the ability to build reliable alliances. One of the most formative experiences of his youth was his own capture and enslavement by a rival clan. He was forced to wear a wooden collar, a symbol of utter humiliation. Yet, even in this desperate state, he did not surrender to despair. He planned his escape, and with the help of a sympathetic guard, he managed to break free, a testament to his indomitable will and his ability to inspire trust, even in his enemies. This period of suffering instilled in Temujin a deep-seated desire for justice and order. He saw the chaos and violence of the tribal world as a disease that weakened his people. The constant cycle of raiding, kidnapping, and revenge kept the Mongols divided and vulnerable. He dreamed of a world where loyalty was rewarded, where laws were respected, and where a man's worth was determined by his merit, not his lineage. This vision was radical for its time. It challenged the very foundations of the aristocratic, clan-based society of the steppes. His personal experiences with injustice fueled his ambition to create a new system based on a code of unbreakable laws and personal allegiance. As he grew into a young man, Temujin began to attract followers. People were drawn to his charisma, his military prowess, and his reputation for fairness. He chose his allies carefully, valuing loyalty and competence above all else. He formed a powerful bond with a young noble named Jamuka, and together they began to build a formidable force. But his most important alliance was with his wife, Berta, whose kidnapping and subsequent rescue became a pivotal event in his rise. The campaign to save her helped him consolidate his power and demonstrate his capabilities as a military leader. From the depths of hardship, Temujin was slowly but surely gathering the strength to reshape his world. Temujin's rise was not a simple path to power. It was a revolutionary act that dismantled the old tribal system. The steppe was a world governed by bloodlines and ancient clan allegiances. A person's identity and loyalty were tied exclusively to their family and tribe. Temujin recognized this as the primary source of the Mongols' chronic disunity. To build a nation, he had to break these old bonds and forge a new, larger identity. He began by reorganizing the very structure of his growing army and the people under his command. He broke up the traditional tribal units and redistributed the members into new groups of 10, 100, and 1,000. This ensured that a warrior's primary loyalty was no longer to his old clan chief, but to his new commander, and ultimately, to Temujin himself. This new system was based on a radical principle for the time: meritocracy. In the old world, leadership positions were inherited. A man was a chief because his father had been a chief. Temujin rejected this idea completely. He promoted his generals based on their skill, bravery, and loyalty on the battlefield, regardless of their social standing or tribal origin. Some of his greatest commanders came from humble backgrounds, and some were even former enemies who had demonstrated their worth and sworn allegiance to him. This approach created an incredibly effective and devoted leadership corps. It meant that the best people were in charge, and it inspired fierce loyalty among his soldiers, who knew that their own advancement depended on their actions, not their birth. In 1206, after years of conflict and alliance building, Temujin finally defeated all his major rivals, including his one-time friend and later foe, Jamuka. He called a great assembly, a kurultai, on the banks of the Onan River. At this historic gathering, the leaders of all the united tribes proclaimed him the ruler of all the people of the felt-walled tents. They bestowed upon him the title of Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. This was more than just a new name. It was the birth of a nation. The scattered, warring Mongol tribes were now one people, the Yeke Mongol Ulus, the great Mongol nation. He was no longer just a Khan of one tribe. He was the Khan of all Mongols. With his people united, Genghis Khan established a code of laws known as the Yasa. While much of the original text is lost, its principles guided the empire for generations. The Yasa made theft and adultery punishable by death, forbade the kidnapping of women, and demanded absolute loyalty to the Khan. It also contained provisions that reflected Mongol values, such as granting diplomatic immunity to envoys, and even forbidding urinating in rivers. This legal framework brought order and discipline to a once chaotic society. It provided a common set of rules that applied to everyone, creating a sense of shared identity and purpose that was essential for the massive undertaking that lay ahead, the conquest of the world. The Mongol army was unlike any other fighting force of its time. Its power did not come from sheer numbers alone, but from its revolutionary organization, discipline, and mobility. The entire military was structured on the decimal system, a simple yet brilliant innovation. Every soldier was part of a 10-man unit called an arban. 10 arbans formed a 100-man company, or zun. 10 of these formed a 1,000-man regiment, or mingan, and 10 regiments formed a 10,000-man division, or tumen. This structure was incredibly efficient. It allowed for clear lines of command, rapid communication, and the ability to deploy forces with precision and flexibility. Orders could be passed down quickly, and units could operate independently or in perfect coordination with the larger army. Every Mongol man between the ages of 15 and 60 was a soldier, a warrior in waiting. From childhood, they were trained to ride horses and shoot arrows with deadly accuracy. A Mongol warrior could ride for days on end, sleeping in the saddle and living off the land. Their primary weapon was the composite bow, a marvel of engineering. It was powerful enough to pierce armor from a distance, and small enough to be used effectively from horseback. Each warrior carried multiple bows and a variety of arrows designed for different purposes, from long-range bombardment to armor-piercing shots. This combination of superb horsemanship and archery skill made the Mongol cavalry a terrifying and seemingly unstoppable force on the open battlefield. Mobility was the cornerstone of Mongol military doctrine. Their armies could travel at speeds that astounded their enemies. Each warrior typically had a string of 3 to 5 horses, allowing them to switch to a fresh mount and cover up to 100 miles in a single day. This strategic mobility meant they could appear where they were least expected, outmaneuver larger and slower armies, and choose the time and place of battle. They traveled light, without the cumbersome supply trains that bogged down conventional armies. They lived off their herds of livestock and by hunting, and they developed methods for preserving meat and milk that allowed them to sustain themselves on long campaigns. This logistical independence gave them a massive advantage over their sedentary foes. Discipline within the Mongol army was absolute and ruthlessly enforced. The principle of collective responsibility was paramount. If one soldier in an arban retreated without orders, the entire unit of 10 would be executed. If an entire arban retreated, the whole zun of 100 men would face the same fate. This brutal discipline forged an unbreakable bond between the soldiers and ensured that units would fight to the last man. It eliminated cowardice and created a fighting force that was predictable and reliable in the heat of battle. This combination of decimal organization, expert horsemanship, tactical mobility, and ironclad discipline created the most formidable military machine the world had yet seen. The Mongols were not just skilled warriors. They were masters of strategy and psychological warfare. Genghis Khan and his generals like Subutai and Jebe were brilliant military minds who understood that battles were won in the mind before they were ever fought on the field. One of their most effective tactics was the feigned retreat. So, a Mongol force would engage the enemy, fight for a short time, and then pretend to break and flee in disarray. This would often lure a confident and undisciplined enemy into a reckless pursuit. Once the enemy line was overextended and broken, the fleeing Mongols would turn on their fresh horses and, joined by hidden reserve forces, would encircle and annihilate their pursuers. Speed and surprise were, honestly, central to every Mongol campaign. Before an invasion, they would gather extensive intelligence about the enemy's territory, political situation, and military strength. They used a vast network of spies and scouts, known as the nokur, to map out terrain, locate water sources, and identify weaknesses. When the time came to attack, they would often advance on a very broad front, with multiple columns moving simultaneously. This made it impossible for the enemy to know where the main blow would fall. They would then converge on a single point with terrifying speed, overwhelming their opponents before they had time to mount a coordinated defense. Their ability to appear as if from nowhere created an aura of invincibility and sowed panic among their foes. Psychological warfare was perhaps their most devastating weapon. The Mongols deliberately cultivated a reputation for terror and ruthlessness. When they approached a city, they would offer terms of surrender. If the city submitted without a fight, its people were often spared and incorporated into the empire. But if it resisted, the consequences were horrific. After a successful siege, the Mongols would often carry out a systematic massacre of the population, sparing only artisans and engineers whose skills they could use. They would then allow a few survivors to escape to other cities to spread tales of the slaughter. This strategy of surrender or die broke the will to resist in many places, causing cities to capitulate without a fight. Now, when faced with the fortified cities of settled civilizations, the Mongols, who had no prior experience with siege warfare, proved to be remarkably adaptive. They learned and perfected siege techniques with astonishing speed. They would conscript captured engineers and laborers to build sophisticated siege engines, such as catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams. They would divert rivers to flood cities, or to cut off their water supply. They would even use captured prisoners as human shields, forcing them to march in the front lines of an assault. This willingness to use any means necessary, combined with their tactical ingenuity and psychological terror, made them as formidable in siege warfare as they were on the open steppe. The unification of the Mongol tribes under Genghis Khan was only the beginning. With his powerful and disciplined army, he turned his sights outward, embarking on a series of campaigns that would redraw the map of Asia. The first major target was the Tangut Kingdom of Xixia, which controlled lucrative trade routes. After a series of campaigns, the kingdom was subdued. Next, the Mongols turned their attention to the powerful Jin dynasty of northern China. The war against the Jin was long and brutal. It was here that the Mongols truly mastered the art of siege warfare, capturing city after city, culminating in the fall of the capital, Zhengdu, modern-day Beijing, in 1215. This conquest gave them access to Chinese technology, engineers, and administrators. The empire's expansion then surged westward in a dramatic and unforeseen way. Genghis Khan had initially sought peaceful trade relations with the wealthy Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled much of Persia and Central Asia. However, when a Mongol trade caravan was murdered and its goods stolen by the governor of a Khwarezmian city, and the Shah refused to make amends, he unleashed the full fury of the Mongol army. The resulting invasion was a masterpiece of strategic coordination. Genghis Khan divided his forces, attacking the empire from multiple directions at once, overwhelming its defenses. Great cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench, centers of Islamic culture and learning, were utterly destroyed, their populations massacred. After the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, his sons and grandsons continued the expansion with relentless energy. His son Ogadei was elected as the new Great Khan and established a permanent capital at Karakoram. Under his rule, the empire pushed further in every direction. Mongol armies completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty in China and launched a massive invasion into Europe. Led by the brilliant general Subutai, the Mongol forces swept through the plains of Russia, sacking Kiev and subjugating the Russian principalities. They then surged into Poland and Hungary, defeating European knights, in a series of stunning victories at Legnica and Mohi in 1241. Europe seemed to be at their mercy. The Mongol conquests were not just about destruction, they were also about integration. As the empire grew, it incorporated a vast diversity of peoples, religions, and cultures. The Mongols were pragmatic rulers. They did not impose their own religion or culture on their subjects. Instead, they practiced a policy of religious tolerance, allowing Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists to worship freely, as long as they obeyed Mongol law and paid their taxes. They recognized the value of the skilled individuals they conquered. They actively recruited artisans, engineers, scholars, and administrators from across the empire, moving them to where their talents could be best utilized, creating a multicultural and dynamic society governed by a Mongol elite. To control an empire of such immense size and diversity required more than just military might. It required a sophisticated system of administration. The Mongols, being nomads with no tradition of urban bureaucracy, proved to be surprisingly adept innovators in the art of governance. They understood their own limitations and were quick to adopt and adapt the systems of the more advanced societies they conquered. They recruited experienced administrators from China, Persia, and elsewhere to run the day-to-day affairs of the empire. A Uyghur scholar named Tatatanga, for example, was tasked by Genghis Khan with creating a written script for the Mongol language, enabling the creation of official records and laws. One of the most important administrative innovations was the establishment of a highly efficient postal relay system known as the YAM. This system consisted of a network of well-stocked relay stations positioned every 20 to 30 miles along the major roads of the empire. Official messengers, carrying a medallion of authority called a paisa, could travel at incredible speeds, acquiring fresh horses, food, and lodging at each station. The YAM was the central nervous system of the empire. allowing for the rapid transmission of official orders, intelligence reports, and administrative correspondence across vast distances. It enabled the Great Khan to govern his sprawling domain effectively and kept the various parts of the empire connected. In matters of law and order, the Mongols were strict but consistent. The legal code established by Genghis Khan, the Yasa, was applied throughout the empire. It created a level of security and predictability that had been absent in many regions. The laws against theft and banditry were enforced so severely that, according to contemporary accounts, a person could walk from one end of the empire to the other with a gold plate on their head without fear of being robbed. This security was not just for the benefit of the Mongols, it was a crucial element in their economic strategy. By making the roads safe, they encouraged the flow of commerce and ensured that tax revenues would reach the imperial treasury. The Mongols also conducted regular censuses of the populations and resources within their territories. This was a massive undertaking that allowed them to create a rational and predictable system of taxation. Instead of the arbitrary and often corrupt tax farming practices of previous regimes, the Mongols established fixed tax rates for different groups, such as farmers and artisans. While the taxes could be heavy, they were at least predictable, which allowed for a degree of economic stability. This systematic approach to administration, combining local expertise with Mongol oversight, legal order, and efficient communication, was the key to holding their vast and diverse empire together for several generations. The Mongol conquests were brutal, but the period of stability that followed their unification of Eurasia is known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace. For roughly a century, a single power controlled the vast landmass from China to Eastern Europe. This unprecedented political unity created a safe and secure environment for travel and trade on a global scale. The Mongols policed the ancient trade routes, collectively known as the Silk Road, with ruthless efficiency. The security provided by the Yasa and the Mongol military cleared the roads of the bandits and petty warlords, who had long preyed on merchant caravans. This ushered in a golden age of commerce and communication between the East and the West. Under the protection of the Pax Mongolica, the Silk Road flourished as never before. Goods, ideas, and technologies flowed freely across the continent. Silk, spices, and porcelain from China made their way to Persia and Europe, while Western goods like glass, textiles, and honey traveled eastward. But the exchange was not limited to luxury items. The real revolution was the transfer of knowledge and technology. Gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and printing techniques, all Chinese inventions, were introduced to the Western world during this period, where they would have a transformative impact. Similarly, Persian astronomy, medicine, and art influenced Chinese culture, creating a vibrant synthesis of ideas. This era of connectivity also changed the world in ways that were unintended and devastating. The same routes that carried merchants and missionaries also became conduits for disease. The most catastrophic example of this was the Black Death. Historians believe the bubonic plague originated in the dry plains of Central Asia and spread along the Mongol trade routes. It reached Europe in the mid-14th century, carried by fleas on rats that infested merchant ships and caravans. The resulting pandemic wiped out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population, causing profound social, economic, and religious upheaval. It was a dark and tragic consequence of this new global interconnectedness. Despite the devastation of the plague, the Pax Mongolica fundamentally altered the world's trajectory. It broke down the isolation that had separated the great civilizations for centuries. For the first time, Europeans like Marco Polo could travel the entire length of Asia and return with detailed accounts of the lands, cultures, and wealth of the East. These accounts fired the imagination of Europe and helped inspire a new age of exploration. The Mongol Empire acted as a world connector, a bridge that brought disparate cultures into direct contact. It created a single interactive world system where events in one part of the globe could have profound effects on the other, laying the foundation for the modern era. The Mongol Empire eventually fractured and declined, but its impact on world history is undeniable and enduring. Genghis Khan and his successors did not just build a fleeting empire of conquest. They fundamentally rewired the world. They shattered old stagnant empires and created a new geopolitical landscape. By creating the largest free trade zone in history, they stimulated a level of commercial and cultural exchange that was unprecedented. They were the agents of globalization in the 13th century, connecting continents and creating a world system where technologies, ideas, and even diseases could spread with astonishing speed. The world after the Mongols was a far more interconnected place than the world before them. The legacy of Genghis Khan himself is complex and often misunderstood. In many parts of the world, particularly in lands that suffered from the Mongol invasions, his name is synonymous with barbarism and destruction. He is remembered as a ruthless conqueror who left mountains of skulls in his wake. However, in Mongolia today, he is revered as the founding father of the nation, a brilliant leader and visionary who united his people and gave them a place on the world stage. His story is a powerful example of leadership born from adversity. He was a master of strategy and organizational genius, and a leader who valued loyalty, merit, and law above all else. The administrative and political innovations of the Mongols also left a lasting mark. Their system of governance, which combined centralized authority with a tolerance for local customs and religions, became a model for later empires. Their use of a postal relay system, paper currency, and diplomatic immunity set standards that were adopted and adapted by other nations. In Russia, the Mongol rule, known as the Tatar yoke, had a profound impact. It isolated Russia from Western Europe for centuries, but it also contributed to the centralization of power that led to the rise of Moscow as the center of a new Russian state. The Mongol influence can be seen in the political and military structures of many nations that emerged from the ashes of their empire. Ultimately, the story of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire is a testament to the power of vision, adaptation, and connection. It shows how a leader from the margins of the known world could rise to reshape it entirely. The Mongols were not simply destroyers, they were also builders and unifiers. They forced disparate cultures to interact, and in doing so, they accelerated the pace of history. Their empire provided the highways for the goods and ideas that would fuel the Renaissance in Europe, and shape the development of nations from China to the Middle East. To understand the making of the modern world, we must understand the legacy of the horsemen from the steppe, who, for a brief but brilliant moment, made the world one.